A lot of words may describe our guest today: doctor, author, hero, but the one thing that stands out is faithful. He served as a Navy psychiatrist assigned to the U.S. Marine Corps during the Vietnam War. He's been married to the same woman for 55 years. He took on a monster of a task in writing this book. Please give a warm, counterculturalized welcome to author of Prejudice, Racism, and Tribalism, a Primer for White People, Dr. Anthony M. D'Agostino. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Happy to be here.
Good. So we always start by asking, where can our listeners find you online?
I do have a website. It's anthonydagostinомd.com. No apostrophe in that one. Apostrophes screw up everything somehow.
That's very true.
So I have to eliminate that. But anthonydagostinомd.com. I have a Facebook page, Facebook author page, Anthony M. D'Agostino, MD. It's got a lot of hate mail on it because a lot of people don't, but I think it's instructive anyway. But a lot of people don't like the title of my book for some reason, and so they feel offended. I also have a podcast, by the way, on Spotify and iHeart and places like that. It's
excellent.
Same title as the book.
Okay,
it's about the book.
That's fantastic. Okay, well, as we like to say, let's start from the beginning. Let's get a little bit of background. We'll lead up to the book in a little bit, but would you give our audience some background and tell about growing up in Chicago, your education, work experience, and all of that?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Chicago. I born in an Italian Catholic family in an area called Little Italy in Chicago, in which I don't think anybody wasn't Italian who lived there. I grew up thinking segregation was good. It was a good thing because that's what normal people did.
Right.
I went to an all-boys Catholic high school. We had 1,600 students in our high school.
That's pretty sizable back in the day.
Yeah, Chicago has an enormous, as probably New York too, an enormous Catholic school system.
Sure.
So I went to a public kindergarten, and everything else was Catholic schools, including university. And I went to I went to University of Illinois Medical School, which happened to be about a mile down the road from where I lived.
So, that's convenient.
Yeah, I mean when I was born.
Right. Okay. Well, fantastic. So you wound up working at Cook County Hospital, and I mean I'm not going to give too much of the book away because I want people to actually get the book, of course, but that seemed like a harrowing experience in my mind working there.
It was a harrowing experience. It was a huge place, 2,000 beds spread out over, many blocks in the Chicago neighborhoods.
Sure.
I talk about that in a chapter entitled "How I Became a Republican," and I became a Republican early in life for two reasons. One is I roomed in college next to the president of the Young Republicans in our school.
Sure.
And so I joined their group because I lived next door to them, but I never went to a meeting, had no idea what they were up to. And then at Cook County Hospital, I got an example of what a political control of public institutions feels like.
Right.
And since in Chicago there were no Republicans when I grew up, so I decided I would become a Republican because it wasn't a Democrat.
You rebel, you.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It was a good example of what a political machine was like running a county hospital, and I describe it in the book, and I was not impressed at all during that time. I then went out to Los Angeles County, Hospital, which was a totally different experience.
Sure.
It was, county run, but had none of the political, at least nothing I was aware of, none of the political sort of attitudes about working there. And it was a totally different experience, a much more positive experience, much less heroin. It was a big place. It was 2,000 beds. In fact, when I was there, the Watts riots, if you recall, 1965, the summer of 65, there were the Watts riots, and it was really a happening place, during that time. A lot of gunshot wounds and things like that.
I was blissfully unaware because I was born in Los Angeles, and I don't remember which hospital, but I was blissfully unaware of all of that stuff going on.
Right. Well,
Vietnam was just a word I heard on the TV, Walter Cronkite every night. I didn't have any concept of what was going on. So, but I went through plenty of my own stuff. Of course, we all do. So you wound up choosing psychiatry as your profession. Very versatile and very what's the word I'm looking for? It's a very useful profession.
We hope so.
Yeah. And I think that you eventually you joined the Navy, you were assigned to Marines during the Vietnam War. Can you give us some insight as to what that was about?
Well, as I mentioned in the book, I did not serve in Vietnam. I had a very nice situation where I spent 2 years in San Diego. But
that's right, San Diego. My apologies.
Right, but it was actually a training base, MCRD in San Diego, in which people who just came from civilian life would be dumped, and they had the Marine experience.
Yeah, I had that.
It was pretty interesting, especially then, because just as I went into the military in July of 1969, the Marine Corps got cut off from the draft. And things are not going well in Vietnam during that. The Tet Offensive was 68, 69. Sure. There was lots of anti-war protests going on in the country, so it was very unpopular to be in the military at that time.
Sure.
Some of I pointed out that one of my friends was in the Army, another psychiatrist from the program that I trained at, and he was in Vietnam, and actually, he kind of liked it there, oddly enough, But when he got back and was stationed at Fort Ord up in Northern California, he couldn't go off the base with his uniform on.
Right.
People would attack him.
Right.
There was a lot of sanctimonious feeling about things at the time. So
sure.
I did write in there about our experiences. San Diego was actually kind of a pleasant place to be. And the Marine Corps and the Navy were well represented both by active duty people as well as retirees.
Right.
And so it was friendly, but outside of San Diego County, it could get a little rough if you were in the military at that time in history.
Especially in California.
Especially in California, yes.
Right. Yeah.
So I wrote about some of that.
Yes, and it's very well written. I got to say, this book in general I really enjoyed it. So let's go ahead and get into the book. What inspired you to take on this subject? Because it's quite a wide-ranging subject and very controversial still, maybe even more so now today than before.
Well, I think it's really hard to say. I think to some extent the first election and the 2016 election of Donald Trump sort of inspired me. I saw, this is sort of an interesting phenomenon. I think we need to take a look at it.
Sure.
So I think the phenomenon just inspired me to take a look. The other thing is, I was kind of upset about the fact that, we're banning books and that librarians and teachers were kind of getting into trouble for teaching American history.
Sure, sure.
And I grew up in an era where, when I grew up, I was, born in the early 40s. And when I grew up in the early 50s, and there was a lot of communism was a big scare, and everybody was, all the communists in the government were being sought out and, eliminated. And there was and yet nobody ever said you can't read Das Kapital.
Right.
You said you can't. In fact, when I went to school, and I went to Catholic schools mostly, but they didn't seem to have any problem talking about, communist theory, at least. I mean, it was not well thought of, but it was, you were allowed to talk about it if you wanted to. There wasn't there was no public outcry against talking, especially in universities and schools. These were, appropriate places to talk about things like that. And now they've sort of become like we shouldn't talk about things like, racism or critical race theories and other things that got me interested. I can't think of any place where anybody was teaching it. I can't remember being taught. I can't remember any. But there was such a thing, and they were allowed to be talked about at universities. And I even heard a news item at one point where in Texas universities, at the university level, state universities, they were thinking of banning such talk. I mean, I can't imagine why anybody at a university would want to ban anything.
Well, I mean, that is the tradition of universities. It's where thoughts are expressed openly and there's discussion. And my wife likes to say the best place for a bad idea is out in the light so people can see it. And, I think it's important to be able, I'm a free speech advocate anyway.
Sure.
But how else are you going to form a worldview? You don't want it. And this is regardless of political leanings or whatever. It's a very bad idea to try and shape people's minds through politics. It's just that's my opinion. But I think that we need to have open conversation. I mean, that's one of the reasons that you wrote this. We need to have an open conversation. Now, keeping in mind, you and I are a couple of older white guys talking about this. So it won't have the same flavor as you talking to a black person. It won't be the same if you talk to an older black person versus a younger one.
Right.
It's always going to be a little bit different.
Right.
So with that in mind, let's dig into this book a little bit more. The title is the subject.
It is. It is a subject. And in fact, on social media, I get a lot of hate mail because of the subtitle, a primer for white people. And I get the messages like, why don't you write a primer for black people? And the answer, of course, is obvious. I'm not a black person. I wrote the book as if I was talking to friends of mine, people that I know. I mean, my family, my friends, my colleagues. I mean, I talk to them as though they're white people, and I'm having a conversation with them about these various things. And a lot of my friends, disagree with some of the things I say in the book, but it's fine. I don't have any problem with that. I don't. The other thing is the title of the book implies that somehow everybody knows what I'm writing about, and so some of the criticisms I've got online are, I know I don't have to read your book because I know what you're going to say. And I don't have to listen to your podcast because I know what you're going to say. And my feeling is, no, you don't.
No, you don't, because, you go into, it's helpful to go into books like this with an open mind and not say, oh, I know what you're going to say. And, let me give you an example. I consider myself rather conservative. However, I also work for the state of Texas in the department that hands out food stamps and Medicaid, and I'm a member of their labor union. I don't exactly fit into any particular, any particular definition is what I'm saying. And, if I make a statement about something that doesn't, you can't figure a person out completely just by one or two things you say, or even by an entire book. You're a multifaceted person. We don't, most of us anyway, aren't that narrow or that
Right,
shallow,
right.
you know?
And I didn't, I felt like, this was, as I'm getting older, this is my sort of last chance to sort of sit down and say what I think about a number of different issues.
Sure.
And talking about this particular kind of issue is kind of risky in many ways because, like I say, people get worked up pretty intensely by the title without listening to what I have to say. But anyway, be that as it may, I decided I would do this, and I enjoyed doing it, and it forced me to think about what I think.
Sure.
What do I think about these various things?
They're important subjects. So one of the things I do like about the book is that you draw distinctions, because my wife and I, we host a podcast, as you know, and we do talk politics a bit. And as a joke, we decided to do a fake game show called "Is This Racist?" And Melanie would read different articles to me saying, is this racist or not? I mean, and it turns out there are college professors, for example, they will say everything from, literally, Dr. Tony, Rice Krispies, traffic signals, math class, it's racist for some reason or another. And it gets to be a point where, like I said earlier, it's like a punchline. It's lost its meaning entirely. And how can you have a conversation about something as important as this when the word's been beaten to death?
Right. I agree.
So let's go over these one by one. Prejudice. Let's get your takes on all three of these, just like a thumbnail of all three of these.
Well, prejudices, everyone has prejudices. You do not, a person does not exist in the world that does not have prejudices.
Right.
The question is, the trick is to figure out which ones you have and which ones you don't have. That's the tricky part. But the reality is we all have that. We're trained. In fact, I use examples like speaking English. Does that give us a prejudice? Well, yes, it does, because we think in terms of English things. We think in terms of English history. We think in terms, like if we were born in a Spanish-speaking South American country, we might get a different slant on life only because we read Spanish and we read what people are writing in Spanish. So you just cannot help but get a different view of life based on where you're from. I was born, around the time of World War II, and I can remember, my whole life that I can remember, at least of the time, was, the English-speaking people were fighting against bad people, the Germans and the Japanese and even the Italians for a while. So you have a different view. Right after the war, there were people, lots of refugees coming to the United States. These were called DPs, displaced persons. We sort of looked down upon them. They spoke a different language. So, the good guys were the British, the Australians, the Americans. And the good guys were the Russians until the war ended. Then the Russians became the bad guys. But it was really who was fighting World War II. It was mostly English-speaking people and Russian-speaking people and German and then Japanese-speaking people, and these guys were all bad. So you can't grow up in a war of, and this was a war of to the death basically, and you can't grow up in that kind of a world without having highly prejudicial views.
Sure.
which after the war, are modified somewhat, but you have to appreciate that. I grew up in a totally Catholic world. I didn't know anyone. I went to school with only people who were Catholic. I went to high school with only people who are Catholic. I went to college only with people who are Catholic. First, I didn't know any Protestants, basically.
Right.
Because this was the world I lived in. So
Right.
I married a Protestant woman.
Right. I was going to mention that.
who had the exact same education as I did, except it was all Lutheran oriented.
Lutheran, right.
So you have to begin to understand. You've got to bend your perspectives a little just growing up. So I talk a lot about prejudice as not related to race in the first chapter, and I talk about prejudice in the courtroom. I happen to be a resident in UCLA right around the time that Sirhan killed Bobby Kennedy.
Right.
And so I went to a program that UCLA conducted, and I was interested in the lawyers who really saw prejudice as natural to human life and something to be exploited. Actually, if you're a good lawyer, you don't necessarily try to eliminate prejudice. What you try to do is you try to get it on your side. And the whole issue of jury selection and legal representation, I mean, it's all about exploiting prejudice. And if you're a good lawyer, you do it better than a bad lawyer does.
Right.
So it's just a natural part of life. In racism, I felt the term is overused. Everybody's a racist. Black people are calling white people racist. White people are calling black people racist.
Right, sure.
Brown people are calling white people racist. I mean, it just becomes meaningless after a time. So I tried to take pains and define it as a thing, a particular thing. And again, I'm not saying I have the last word. I'm only saying that if you define it more clearly, and we all agree to use it in this way, we at least know what we're talking about.
Exactly. This was the entire crux of the book as far as I'm personally concerned. But on page 34 of your book, you're quoting Ijeoma Oluo. I hope I got her name right, or their name right.
I can't pronounce her name either. Yeah.
It's called So You Want to Talk About Race, gives two different definitions of racism. The second one is really what drives you and what actually, that's what hit home for me. So would you be kind enough to give our audience a little bit more about that?
Well, in that particular definition, which I arbitrarily chose that as what I like, I think it should be. It's where you're prejudiced against somebody because of their race, but the racism part is when you use instruments of power to utilize. So simply, and I use the example of the Nation of Islam, which is a Chicago institution, by the way. Black Muslims, and I say they've got these wildly bizarre theories about white people and they're devils and they came from a different planet and all the rest. So what I thought was amusing, it's just that it doesn't impact me. They haven't impacted me in a way that matters. So they merely have bad opinions about white people, bad opinion. When you have merely bad opinions, you don't really do anybody any real harm. When you
It's true.
When you control their schools, or you control their workplace, or you control their government, or you control the laws that influence them, that's power. That's real. The rest of it is just, we all hate one another at some point. I mean, I guess I'm too accepting of that human quality, but I just have, I grew up in the city. People are always, yelling at one another, complaining about one another,
of course.
saying bad names about one another, calling each other names. So it was sort of like, what else is new? Tell me what really matters, and that's how I define racism. Racism on the backs of NFL football helmets is meaningless. It means
Right.
it means that we should all love one another, and we all smile and say, "Well, it'll never happen," but
Yeah.
it's a nice sentiment.
It's the Christian ideal. God
Yes,
tells us to love each other, and on some level we want to do that, but being
when push
human.
comes to shove, we need more than that, really.
Right, right. And sloganeering doesn't really do a whole
Right,
lot.
right. So, I feel like let's define what this is, and then we'll understand it better, and we can talk about it. The
Sure.
other, the tribalism, I think, is again another human instinct. I think
Sure.
that
Yeah.
if you look at the history of humankind, going back as far as we can possibly find it, probably even
Right.
before Homo sapiens,
Sure.
probably even in Neanderthal, you see that tribalism is an important human instinct.
Hmm.
It's a social instinct. It's a preserving kind of instinct,
Hmm.
and we probably have it because in these several million years of hominid evolution,
Right.
we just it would turned out to be useful somehow. So
Hmm.
we're not going to totally get rid of that.
No.
We have to find a way to live with it, but you can't really eliminate it totally.
Right.
And I sort of think Trump is a good example of somebody who's kind of masterful at
Hmm.
that sort of instinctual thing, and you got to give him credit.
Hmm. We will talk more about him later in the light of the election results. Certainly. I happen to agree with you. I think tribalism is something that it's organic. Yeah, it's almost organic because we need to feel like we belong, and if we know if we're with enough people, it's usually our families and our immediate community to start with. We need to feel like we belong. We're not solitary creatures.
Right.
Sometimes we want to be, but that's just not reality. So I appreciate the fact that you took the effort to separate the three of them and define each one. I think it's very, very important. Um, and also in this book, you give a lot of historical context and examples of all three of these. Would you like to give us a few examples of historical examples of this and how it pertains today?
Well, I mean, historically, I mean, if you look at the last 50 years, you get
Hmm.
kind of confused. But if you
Sure.
look at the last 5,000 years, you'll see that people um, tend to value people like them more than they
Hmm.
value people who are not like them.
Hmm.
So if you're going to live in a world where a lot of people are not like you, you're going to have to develop a new kind of skill, probably. Uh,
Right.
so, and I think we all live in I think the human beings we sort of have a sense of safety when things are predictable and when there are people that we know. It's like when you walk, when you meet somebody in, let's say you're in Africa and you meet somebody you went to high school with, or you
Hmm.
meet somebody that went to your high school.
Hmm.
You'll never see that person again, but you feel a certain
A
connection.
certain kinship, right?
Yeah, there's a kinship, there's a feeling of relatedness that
Hmm.
exists beyond, and you'll never see the person again, and you never saw the person before, and yet you
Right.
feel a certain kind of closeness. This is instinctual, in human beings.
Hmm.
Uh, Historically, I'm not sure what you mean, but I mean, there's so many different historical things that I use in the book. But
Hmm.
one of the things that I talk about is um, I think white people don't know how to respond to history in some ways. And the problem is that for the last 500 years, white people have outperformed most other people
Sure.
technologically. I mean,
Right.
they have been more superior. They have developed science. They have so when Cortez came to conquer Aztec America,
Right.
there was no thought about gee, should I be doing this? Is this a nice neighborly thing to do? No, he was a conqueror. His idea
Right.
was to conquer the people. But that's not an unheard of thing in humanity.
Certainly
And
not.
in fact, the Spanish, who conquered, Central America and South America, they just came off 700 years of being conquered by the North Africans.
Right.
So, so
Can't get a break.
we don't understand is that the dominant language in the Iberian Peninsula for like 500 years, which is the amount of time that white people have been in the Americas, 500 years.
Sure.
That the dominant language there was Arabic for 500 years. So it's, whether you like it or not, this is the way people do things. And you have to, if you understand human history, you understand that, people don't always behave like, the Jesus Sermon on the Mount type of thing.
Right. Exactly.
That's how people are. So you have to learn to live with that. And I use as an example, one of the examples I use in the book is Melissa Villaseñor. She was a performer on Saturday Night Live.
Right.
And there's a program that I always watch. It's called Finding Your Roots, by Henry Louis Gates. It's on PBS Tuesday nights in Chicago. And I never miss it. But they had her on one time. And it turns out that I use her as an example of how white people respond to historical things, sometimes inappropriately.
Right.
And it turns out that her 12th great-grandfather, goes back 500 years. He was one of the conquistadors that showed up with Cortez. And so just watching her, as if you're familiar with Gates's style, what he does is they do a marvelous job of finding, your relatives going back many hundreds of years. And they were able to find hers going back 500 years.
Wow.
And just as she's listening to the story, her facial emotions in her face go up and down according to what part of the story she was listening to. And I try to talk about, for example, he said, oh, your 12th great grandfather was a Basque nobleman. Oh, how no, I'm a Basque. She didn't even know that. So she go, oh, I'm a Basque, whatever that means. And then he said, well, of course, he was one of the conquistadors that came over with Cortez and conquered the people. And then she looks sad, and then she feels like guilty. And then he says, well, we've examined your genome and you're 25% indigenous. And she smiles and she says, oh, I'm indigenous. Isn't that nice? And then she says, you're 2% West African. And she smiles and says, oh, gee, I'm 2% West African. How nice. And then he says, well, of course, that means that one of your 12 great-grandfathers probably had a slave, and a black slave. And then she, looks upset again. And she got so upset that he has to rescue her.
Right.
She's so upset that he has to jump in and say, but that's on them, not on you. Like it's a terrible thing. I mean, this is human history, folks.
Sure.
This is what life has been like for thousands of years. There's really no reason for her to react that way, but this is how she reacts.
Some people feel very connected to their past. Now, me, I was adopted, so my family tree is really kind of about this big. So, you know,
well, my family tree begins when my grandparents got here in 1908 and 1909,
right.
and that's it. I mean, I have absolutely no awareness beyond that, and I
Right.
don't exactly see how that's relevant either.
It mostly isn't. It isn't.
Right, right.
You know.
Because if
But some
you,
people treat it with such importance, you know,
right,
and so
right,
and
right,
I tend to respect that, but at the same time, I'm with you on that it's just I'm not responsible for what my dad did, let alone what my great great
right.
great grandfather did.
Right. And I put in the book, I've got an uncle went to prison, for selling heroin, and I had
Right.
another uncle who was in the Federal Witness Protection Program. So,
Right.
I mean, I still never understood what that had to do with me.
It
But
doesn't.
for some people, it doesn't really. And also, if you take somebody like Villaseñor and you go back, to 12 great grandfathers, she's got about as much DNA from that grandfather in her as she has Neanderthal DNA.
Right.
The
Right.
Europeans, by the way, have about 2% Neanderthal genes still, most Europeans. So she's got as much DNA from this conquistador grandfather as she's got of Neanderthals. So what does that mean? Nothing.
Yeah, doesn't
Nothing.
mean much.
Doesn't mean much.
And that,
So
yeah.
I try to, let's take a look at that, and let's see if let's see, how guilty should we feel. And my conclusion is not very. You should feel guilty about what happens today.
Right, and that's all we can do. Really, is monitor ourselves or ask our friends and loved ones. Okay, am I racist? What am I doing that might be racist? And what can I do to make it right to anybody I've offended or hurt? A lot of, and basically what the racism that you're talking about is what is often called systemic racism or institutional racism,
Right.
as opposed to prejudice or tribalism. Like I said before, I don't think it is as bad as it once might have been. Once again, that doesn't mean, hey, it's better now, and we walk away and don't do anything about it.
Right. My point in the book was simply to talk about the way things are now,
Right.
and to not to get any other kind of message.
Right.
I use an example of the black psychologist. Remember that one?
Right.
Where she's on a plane, or
And her
she's
boy.
when she's 12 years old, and as an example of prejudice that might be inborn in human beings.
Right.
She's 12 years old. She's in an all-black neighborhood. Everybody she knows is black. The teachers, the grocers, everybody. And then she moves to a more white neighborhood, and she can't remember the names of the white girls in her class because they all look alike.
Right. Right. And what is one of our big prejudices as white people? Or sometimes as a mean joke, but they all look alike. Well, they don't, but
of course not. But she's a good example of how that this is kind of a human thing. When something is different, we key on that feature and we don't key on other features.
Right.
When something is familiar, we don't key in on skin color. We key in on other aspects. It's just a human characteristic.
Right.
And when she's on the plane with her son, and her son looks over at the only black man on the plane and says, "Is he going to rob the plane, Mama?" She feels like he stuck a dagger into her heart. But
I can't even imagine what that must have felt like.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
But her son, who's 5 years old, is saying, "There's a black man. Is he a criminal?"
Right.
Okay. So that's called that's
completely believable, but
right. That's what I try to say is, well, if you ever hear the word systemic, that's that's an example of
Yeah,
systemic.
it's a very sad and very good example. Absolutely.
Right.
So let's talk about modern times, because we've been talking mostly about the historical context of these concepts, but right now we're living in a world where we have one side saying Black Lives Matter, the other saying all side, all everybody matters, and so both of them walk away after saying that to each other. Nothing gets accomplished, and they're both frustrated and angry, and maybe just feeling that they're just digging in deeper in their own belief systems.
Right.
So, what do you see as some of the elements that we can look at and maybe find some common ground in working on fixing?
Well, I must admit that it was not my purpose to fix society by writing the book.
Sure,
It was
sure.
simply an attempt to educate people I know and my
Hmm.
friends to what the terms are and
Right.
why we use them. But again, I think most white folks that I know,
Hmm.
well, I mean, I know a lot of fairly intelligent white folks, and I can't speak for all of them, but I'm saying a lot of people, they feel very offended when somebody say Black Lives Matter. For some
Hmm.
reason, a lot of us white people are offended by that statement, and
Hmm.
and all lives matter is a way of sort of undermining whatever that
Right.
means. And
Right.
uh, so the purpose of the book is to stop and say, well, let's look at what these things really mean rather
Hmm.
than, responding in our sort of prejudicial, visceral way of, oh,
Right.
am becoming angry every time we hear somebody say something like that.
Exactly.
Obviously, Black Lives Matter is supposed to indicate that they think a lot of us white folks don't think Black Lives Matter. I mean, that's the issue.
Good point.
Right. It
Yeah.
isn't. It isn't somehow like we're trying to take over the world or anything like that. And why do we find that offensive?
Right. As
Um,
if saying Black Lives Matter means white lives don't.
right.
Well,
Yeah, or it's some kind. I don't know. I don't, because when the Black Lives Matter thing came out of the fact that many black people think that we white folks think it's okay to kill people if
right.
they're black, or it's okay for policemen to kill them if they're black.
Right.
Um, and I can't speak for policemen. I'm not going to castigate. In the book, I don't castigate
No,
policemen
you
for acting the way they do. I don't know what I would do if I was a cop in some of these neighborhoods, but
sure.
I just say let's stop and think about why these folks, maybe they're wrong, but they think that we don't mind them getting shot and killed.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
so I simply raise that issue, and I talk about what I think they mean by these things in my
Sure.
attempt, since it's for white people I'm writing the book.
Right.
And
Right.
I give my interpretation of what that means, and then I sort of ask the question, why are we offended, by these things?
Hmm.
On the other hand, nobody likes to be robbed, nobody likes to be carjacked, nobody likes to be, and it is true that higher percentages of, I'll say, poor people are involved in crime.
Sure.
When my people came here back in 1910 and 1909, I mean, there were more of us involved in crimes in the street probably than there were people who were more affluent, of course,
Hmm.
because that's what happens with people who are relatively poor. So you're going to get more
Hmm.
crime among black people
Right.
because of their socioeconomic. I mean, there's not more crime among middle class black people than there are among middle class white people or
Right.
middle class
Right.
Asians. There isn't. There's more crime among poor white people than there is among affluent white people. I mean,
Of
that's
course.
is part of And I think the history of separation and racism and all that in the past has probably, has its mark.
Sure.
It has its sign. So you're not going to. But I think white people take these things too personally. They are personally offended. They are personally angered. They are personally upset by these allegations, like we're
Right.
being accused of stuff. And, and in many cases we are, but
Mm-hmm.
you have to put the thing in context.
Sure.
I was, I remember when I was a resident in Los Angeles, I was at a school one day, and this was the day of the Hong Kong flu. I don't know if you remember that, but it was
Vaguely.
in the late '60s. There was something
Right.
that was going around called the Hong Kong flu, and I was at a black school, and the black principal was upset about the term Hong Kong flu because
Mm-hmm.
she thought we were ripping Chinese people
Right.
for
Right.
causing the flu, much like
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump calls it
With the Wuhan virus of
China
China,
flu. Yeah,
of
the
China
China
flu.
flu
Right.
or China COVID, whatever it is. And she was offended because we were using, but Hong Kong flu. I had to tell her it's called the Hong Kong flu because it was identified in Hong Kong. That's how.
Right. Same thing with
It
the Spanish
wasn't.
flu earlier.
You're right. It wasn't because people were prejudiced against Chinese people.
Right.
So you get these kinds of misconceptions,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Mm-hmm.
which are in some ways, I guess, natural because we have our prejudices that we bring to
Sure.
situations. But that doesn't mean we have to buy into every single prejudice that comes our way.
Exactly. Exactly.
So anyhow, that's my thoughts on the matter.
Okay. Um, you several times in the book. Let's talk about Donald Trump. Several times in the book, you are referring to his administration as symptomatic of white supremacy in America. Okay. Well, since this book's been written, since we agreed to do this interview, we all know what happened on November 5th.
Yeah.
He won. I never used the word landslide, but it was a decisive win. And there were reports, polls, I don't know if you believe the polls, that a significantly larger number of black men voted for Trump or voted Republican, let's put it that way, than before. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, I'm not a political analyst, so
Right. Sure.
I don't necessarily, I can't speak for things. I do feel that his victory, both the first time and the second time, were in effect reflections of a certain enthusiasm about some aspect of him. In other
Sure.
words, I don't think somebody says, well, it was the inflation. Well, yeah, but I don't think so. Well,
Mm-hmm.
it was this, well, it was that. I think what I think he understands more than most people is
Mm-hmm.
that 65% of the electorate is white.
Right. That's true.
That 12% of the electorate is black,
Mm-hmm.
and 13% of the electorate is Hispanic.
Mm-hmm.
So by the electorate, I mean the people who actually vote.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So and I think this was the first time and the second time. I think that I think white people feel that he has their interest in mind,
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
he is not going to blame them for history. For example, I was told, and I didn't count them, but I was told that there were 30,000 ads that were run, paid for by Musk, um, about this transgender person who was in the California prison system that
Mm-hmm.
Kamala Harris facilitated his getting a sex change operation for.
Huh.
I don't know if you saw that.
No, I missed that one entirely.
Well, okay. And apparently, they were shown during football games and
Mm-hmm.
during the World Series. Quite a
Mm-hmm.
few times. So there was an emphasis on that. So I think it always puzzled me that it motivated me to look up, what percentage of the adult population in America identifies as transgender.
Sure.
Well, it turns out to be 1.14%.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering why 30,000 ads about this transgender thing were supposedly aired during the last few weeks of the election. Why that was so important.
Mm-hmm.
So again, my belief is that you focus on the things that you identify with. And most people, I mean, by definition, most people don't like LGBTQ people. They simply don't like them. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, most people in the world
Right.
don't like them. So why, so Joe Biden gets insulin down to $35 a month
Mm-hmm.
for at least Medicare recipients.
Sure.
Uh,
Sure.
People in the United States who use insulin is 11% of the population. 11%.
Right. Right.
Insulin is going between $700 and $1,000 a month. Okay, so you wonder why people don't care about that, and they care about this prisoner in
This one prisoner
California
who's, yeah.
who, I'm sure, like it's as if we're all going to be, transformed into transsexuals if we elect Kamala. Whatever it is, there's a certain
Right.
tribal instinct that we respond to when we see those things. And I
Mm-hmm.
think he did it very well. I mean, I'm giving him a compliment, really,
Yeah.
because there are very few people that understand that kind of tribal instinctual urge.
Right.
So, I mean, do you vote for the guy who is okay with this, with somebody going from a male to a female, or do you, I mean, you don't. You vote for the guy that is for the AR, and make sure you get an AR-15 that doesn't like transgender people, doesn't like
Sure.
all these queer people.
Right.
So if you can get people to identify with your view as opposed to the other person's view. But
Mm-hmm.
I think Donald Trump's victory is the victory of white people over the rest of the country.
Okay.
I think it's their victory. White people are going to win out in the end, and this is an example, no
Do
matter
you
what
think?
he says or does.
Yeah. Fair. Do you see that changing at all with the shifting? Um, and I mean, it is what it is for the moment, but in the future, as we're seeing the demographics shift in some ways rather drastically towards non-WASPs, if you will, the people who are not white, Christian, evangelical types. Now I'm white, I'm evangelical, and I'm Christian.
Right.
I personally don't feel threatened by all of this, but when the 20 years from now, do you think this is going to change at all?
Well, I think yes, some of it will change because it always changes. I
Right.
mean, the there's a sort, and I think in the book I talk about sort of the Hegelian sort of
Mm-hmm.
model of social change.
Right.
You have the thesis, and then you have something that's antithesis. It already has changed. For example. In the 1970s, you were probably just born around then, but I
I was
remember
young.
there was Anita Bryant. Anita Bryant had this
Right.
big crusade, Save the Children, She was going to protect the children from all these homosexuals who were going to busy transforming all the children.
I do remember her, and I thought she was bats then.
Right. So she said, homosexuals don't breed, they recruit. Okay? They don't breed, they recruit. Now, a few years ago, the city of Chicago elected a Black homosexual mayor who was married to another woman.
Sure.
It was not an issue in the campaign. It was not an issue during her administration.
Right.
She had plenty of problems, but that wasn't one of them.
Yeah.
So if you'd have told me 50 years ago that we were going to elect a homosexual mayor who was married to another woman, I would have thought you were nuts.
Yeah.
So these changes do occur over time. And I'm not saying they necessarily occur in the more liberal direction either. I mean,
right.
I was a registered Republican up until 2016. So I traditional Republican views are not, abhorrent to me.
Right.
But I think, I think a lot of white people in the country feel like we're on the verge of some kind of terrible thing. I heard, evangelical preachers say that, God wanted Trump to be president, and that God was, active in this race, and so I think there's a feeling like we've got to save ourselves now. Sure. But I'm a physician. I've worked most of my life in a world where a lot of the physicians are not white people. And they seem to be pretty much like me, as far as I can see. So.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Tony, it might be hard to believe, but we've been at this for about an hour now. So
really?
We're going to go ahead and wrap this up shortly. But before we do, were there any last thoughts you wanted to give our audience?
No, I mean, I think if you read the book or even listen to the podcast, I think you might agree with me on some issues. And
sure.
Even if you're fairly conservative.
Once again, I thought this was a fascinating book. I didn't agree with everything you wrote, of course, but it opened my eyes, it opened my mind, and any book that can do that is a gift. It's a treasure. Tell us one last time before we go where people can find you.
Well, AnthonyDagostinoMD.com, and I do have a Facebook author page under my name. I'm not sophisticated enough with social media to tell you how to find it. Just know it's out there because people are sending me all kinds of interesting opinions. So
yeah. You just set yourself up in a way when you write a book like this that people are going to prejudge, show prejudice. Who knew?
Right.
Okay. Well, Dr. D'Agostino, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I enjoyed this conversation very much. And as my wife said, we will have this up soon. We will let you know. There will be links to your Amazon page, of course, so that you can, people who are interested can check this book out. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a great holiday.
You too. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it myself.